Hello, welcome everyone to this Top Employers Institute webinar. Before we start, I want to remind the audience that we are providing AI-generated audio and caption translations from English to French, German, Italian, Mandarin, Polish, Portuguese, and Spanish. By clicking on the link that just popped up on your screen, you'll be taken to a separate tab where you can select caption or audio translation in your preferred language, making sure that everyone can enjoy this webinar. My name is Sarah Andresen. I am the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Top Employers Institute, and I am so excited to be here today with two of our guests who are going to be talking about neuroinclusion and neurodiversity, a topic very, very close to my heart. I personally am dyslexic and have had a lifelong journey of dealing with the opportunities and the challenges that come with being a neurodivergent person. And so I'm really excited to be here today to talk with two experts about neuroinclusion. So help me welcome our experts, Elaine and Tristan. Can you join me? Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here today with us and spending some time to talk about neuroinclusion. Elaine is an assistant professor in human resource management at Hasselt University in Belgium. Her research focuses on diversity and inclusion in the workplace, particularly concerning individuals with disabilities, neurodivergence, and chronic illnesses. And Tristan is the founder and chair of Philips Neurodiversity Network, a global ERG that aims to raise awareness and foster understanding of neurodiversity at Philips. I would love to get started by just understanding from both of you a little bit more around what brought you to neurodiversity, both personally and professionally. Alina, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you, Sarah, for raising this important question. I guess I've been interested in matters of diversity and inclusion, and particularly related to the labor market, both self-employment and in settings of waged employment for over 10 years. And it started out with a main interest in disability and chronic illness, but over time neurodiversity sort of came in. And it was in 2018 already that I started my first project, which was back then on entrepreneurs who identified as neurodivergent, because there was a lot of talk in the research community of entrepreneurship about how people with ADHD, for instance, may be better at starting businesses because of their high tolerance for risks, or because of their high energy, etc. And I wanted to better understand the lived experiences behind those statistics that were showing that this was indeed the case. But I guess my personal interest in this topic also comes from my own diagnosis, which I received not that long ago. It was when my daughter started going to primary school and had to start getting to know small mathematics, and I was reminded of child trauma of tutoring and not being able to understand why I could not succeed in very simple arithmetic tasks. And so a couple of years back, I got my diagnosis officially, because this was something I always knew, of course, that I had. Dyscalculia is my neurodivergent condition specifically. And that, of course, makes me as motivated as ever to continue on this journey of researching the topic of neurodiversity together with other neurodivergent people.
Fantastic. I know how hard it can be when you are young and you're struggling to learn when you are neurodivergent. From personal experience, I remember my early school years to be very, very challenging. Tristan, what about you? What brought you to this topic?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for being here. And echoing your stories, Sarah and Eileen, my passion for this topic has also really been shaped by my own personal experiences. So in my case, I was diagnosed with autism almost 20 years ago now, when I had a bit more hair than I do today. And that really turned my world upside down at the time, because all I'd ever read and heard about autism was about the negatives, about the limitations, the deficits. So that is why I never felt comfortable sharing with anyone that I'm autistic, especially in professional settings, essentially because I was afraid that people would think less of me if they knew that I was autistic. So it was only 3 years ago that I finally felt comfortable coming out as autistic. Because at that point in my life, I'd come to recognize that being different does not mean being less. Yes, there are still things that I struggle with as an autistic person, but I can also offer original perspectives, and there are things that I can do quite well precisely because I see the world differently. And that is also what I've come to appreciate about many of the neurodivergent people that I've had the pleasure of meeting ever since I started sharing my story. Each of them are unique in their own right, but they haven't always felt understood or supported in their career. And that is also what motivated me then professionally to set up our neurodiversity network at Philips, because I essentially wanted to create a safe haven, a place where neurodivergent colleagues can share their experiences, but also use our lived experience to educate the wider organization about the value of neurodiversity and ensure that everyone feels seen for who they are, and that their strengths are recognized, but also that they get support for any challenges that they may face in their day-to-day work.
I love what you just shared. Being different does not mean less. I feel like I want to get that on a bumper sticker or maybe a tattoo where I can really live that, because I think it's something that many of us who have struggled with, various components of neurodiversity have felt at various points in time, and really being able to feel like we can start to come forward and come out and have those conversations is, I think it's really powerful. And I love that we're 3 neurodivergent individuals here being able to talk about a topic that is so important for us to discuss. It's obvious why the 3 of us care about neuroinclusion, but I'd love to focus a little bit more on the business imperative. Why should companies invest in neuroinclusion, and what are the strong business drivers for neuroinclusion? Tristan, what can you add to this perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you just take a small step back first, I think many of you joining this session, especially if you work in larger organizations, you will recognize that there's often still a strong one-size-fits-all mindset, because one best way of doing things and there's one best way of working together. And I always like to say that is essentially a mindset that comes from the industrial age, where you had people lined up in factories all doing the same work in the same way. And I think today there's a growing recognition in organizations that we're not actually all the same. We all think differently, we communicate differently, and we all have different needs and preferences when it comes to the work environments within which we operate. Some of us need quiet spaces, others enjoy being around other people. And I think that when organizations begin to recognize and embrace these differences, it means from a business point of view, first, that they are able to tap into a wider talent pool. You're giving a fair chance to that dyslexic or autistic job candidate that may have been overlooked before. So there's the talent acquisition, but then secondly, they can also get more value out of that talent by empowering that person to do their best work. And then thirdly, that also increases the chances that that talent will stay with your organization, because people feel seen and supported. I hear that every day from people in our network at Philips, that they now finally feel that they are truly at home in our organization, which is for many of them also a reason to stay with our organization. So I think zooming out from a business point of view, there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense to invest in this topic. It's not just the right thing to do, but it also makes your teams and it makes your organization stronger.
I love the focus on really being able to bring people in and helping them feel included within the organization. There's so much power within that, creating that space. And I think you really hit it on the head too, of enabling that talent to thrive in a situation. I know that we've seen statistics that, 15 or 20% of people are likely neurodivergent. And you think of, if that exists within your organization and 15 or 20% of your talent is not able to fully reach their potential, that you're leaving a lot of productivity on the table for an organization. Elena, would you like to expand on that? How do you see the business case for neuroinclusion?
Sure. Yeah, I think Tristan already summed up some really good, valid points that academic research has also found. And maybe there's two more that we could add that help us explain why businesses who do neuroinclusion well can thrive. And the first one is that customers nowadays, and sometimes it's said millennials especially, they really look for businesses that do well, that are socially responsible. So also from a customer perspective, that would really help, knowing that the business that you're buying a product or a service from is hiring neuro-inclusively. And then a second thing is that research has found that in companies where it becomes normalized to ask for help from a colleague because there's something you can't do, whether that is because of a physical impairment you have, for instance, not being able to reach the top shelf, or whether that is because your admin skills suck like my own, pardon my language, then that sort of cultivates a culture in which it's okay to ask for help. And that leads in the end to a more collaborative culture. And we know that those are especially performative in certain settings, which require, for instance, the solving of complex problems. Yeah.
Elena, no, go ahead, Tristan.
No, I just briefly wanted to build on the customer angle, because I think that is really important and sometimes overlooked aspect of this conversation as well. Because the fact is also that, yes, we have neurodiverse workforces, but we also have neurodiverse customers. And our customers, whatever business we operate in, they also have their own communication needs, preferences. So I think having a neurodiverse workforce and empowering that workforce also allows you to serve your customers better, because you better understand what individual customers may need.
I think that's a great point. As a product person, being able to create and design products that meet the needs of your customers, really, you need to understand your customers. And if your customers are neurodivergent, and we just established that 15 to 20% of people are neurodivergent, so it's likely customers are neurodivergent, then it really helps to have employees who are neurodivergent who understand those needs. And I think it's a really important part of thinking about inclusion in general and diversity of your workforce, and making sure that it reflects your customers. I loved, Elena, as well, how you highlighted that being neuroinclusive isn't just good for your neurodivergent employees, but it was really good for your entire workforce. That the policies or practices you put in place that support your neurodivergent talent also build collaboration and create a culture that helps the rest of your talent to do well, which I think is a really important point to do. I think we'd be remiss if we don't switch to those at the top, our leaders, and their involvement in neuroinclusion and how that can help organizations. Elena, do you want to talk a little bit about leadership and how that interacts with neuroinclusion?
Sure. Research has found that leadership and the commitment of leaders, and especially also top leaders, is very important when it comes to creating and fostering a culture of neuroinclusion. Because when your leaders and your top leaders, your CEO, your CTO, and so on, openly show that they find inclusion important, then this will give a very strong message to the rest of the organization that the company is serious about this, and slurs and insensitive comments or whatever, microaggressions, they will not be tolerated, and this is important. And apart from those top leaders, of course, everyday leaders like supervisors also play an important role in the everyday support. Because although neurodivergent people oftentimes bring unique talents, we could even say superpowers, to the workplace, like, for instance, superior pattern recognition or being able to see the big picture or details on the opposite, they do sometimes also need a little extra help or support. And supervisors in that sense become very important. They might need an extra amount of explanation for certain tasks, or we might need some help on prioritizing tasks. So in that sense, supervisors are super important.
Tristan, what's your experience with leadership involvement in neuroinclusion?
I think what Alina just described, based on research, I see that reflected in our day-to-day reality at Philips as well. I mean, reflecting on Alina's first point, I think senior leadership has indeed a critical role to play in role modeling, openness, vulnerability on this topic. Well, like you're doing today also, Sarah, in your role. I've seen that at Philips as well. It's going to be very hard for that 20-year-old something trainee to open up about their ADHD or autism if they see no one in a senior position open up about this topic. So whenever a senior leader at Philips has opened up about their story, that has always had a huge positive impact, because it just lowers the barrier for other people in the organization to do the same. And as Aileen said, it signals that it is something that the organization takes seriously. And I also recognize what Aileen said about the importance of supervisors or line managers. I mean, they can make or break the experience of a neurodivergent employee. I've always been relatively lucky to have had supportive managers, even before I felt comfortable being open about my autism. Unfortunately, I also speak to neurodivergent people on a daily basis who are not so fortunate. I think we should acknowledge that as well. And a big barrier for them is often that they don't experience the necessary psychological safety in their team. There's also research, example from Birkbeck University of London, which shows that 65% of neurodivergent people in organizations do not feel comfortable having that conversation with their manager. So I think that's a really important responsibility for managers, supervisors to be aware of, that it's their responsibility to create that safety in their team for people to express what they need, which doesn't even necessarily mean disclosing a diagnosis, but simply having that conversation about, hey, I get easily distracted, I need a quiet work environment. That is the sort of conversation that line managers can really help initiate with their people, I think.
I personally got involved with our organization recently in sharing my own story of being dyslexic, and I jumped at the chance at first, as I wanted to support neuroinclusion, and I was really surprised actually at how hard it was to kind of come up in a public forum and speak about my challenges that I'd had being dyslexic, but then I saw how absolutely powerful it was to open up and be vulnerable in front of the rest of the organization and share my story. And reflecting on that moment, I think of how hard it was for me as a senior leader to talk about something that has often had negative experiences for people in a public space. But there was so much benefit for the rest of the organization in really creating that space and being able to give them that role model for what it can look like. So I'm hopeful that as more leaders who also suffer from various things like this, that they feel empowered to do that. And if there are anyone in a leadership position, I would really encourage them to make that leap, because I think it can be very, very impactful within an organization, which I think really brings us to that other part, which is around, Tristan, I think you mentioned it a little bit, the psychological safety, and how important that is for being able to build that. Do you want to expand a little bit on psychological safety, what it is, and any frameworks or strategies to help leaders build that environment?
Yeah, sure. So I think in the context of neurodiversity, it essentially means that people in a team feel safe to be open about who they are, about what they need to be at their best, and also to voice their opinions when they're having conversations with the rest of the team. And yeah, as I said, I think a lot of neurodivergent people do not experience that psychological safety yet. So we proactively need to create that as organizations. And yeah, that can sound a bit abstract, but yeah, I think it starts with that line manager, that supervisor, just asking those simple practical questions. For example, when a new member joins the team, like, what is your preferred communication style? What kind of environment suits you best? What do you need from me to do your best work? It's these very simple and basic questions that may sound obvious, but in the rush of day-to-day corporate life, we don't always ask these questions. So I think that is really the starting point for managers to start creating that psychological safety, and then responding with openness, with an open mind. Because I think a common pitfall, which I'm also definitely guilty of myself, is that we assume that what works for us works for others as well, while that is often not the case. So it's really a matter of asking questions and then practicing active listening with an open mind. I think that's really the starting point.
Elena, would you have any other suggestions or for how to build psychological safety within organizations and what leaders can do?
I guess I just agree that there's a lot of power in vulnerability and showing your vulnerability as a leader to help set that scene which feels safe for others to disclose what they are good at and what they're not good at. And that, of course, is a very humane thing to do. So I think when others share their failures or their difficulties, that really helps create an environment in which people can be forgiven for making small mistakes, and which also helps map out what people's strengths and what their weaknesses are, which is, I think, a valuable thing to have in any team, whether it's completely neurotypical or neurodiverse.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Sarah, if I can maybe add one thing. A question that I sometimes get from leaders in this context, but how do I know whether my team member is neurodivergent in the first place? Whereas I think a better way of looking at it is you're never going to know for sure as a leader, as a manager, unless that person feels comfortable sharing it with you. And no one should ever feel forced to share it with you either, because some people prefer just to keep their dyslexia or dyscalculia to themselves, and that's to be respected as well. So I think as a manager, if you focus on understanding people's needs, the diagnosis or label also becomes less relevant to a certain extent, because it's really focusing on practically what can I do to support this person irrespective of labels.
I think that's an important point, and it's really a benefit that can expand beyond those who do have official diagnoses or labels that they have. An environment or culture where there is a lot of psychological safety, where we are giving people space to ask for additional, accommodations or the needs that they might have to be able to do their best work, really can benefit everyone within the organization. Not only those of us who have official diagnoses. Moving on to policies or internal structures that can really support neurodivergent employees, such as ERGs or any other types of representative groups. Any suggestions that you would have there? Elena, why don't we start with you?
You mean on employee resource groups, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think those are a very powerful practice. I think the building of community works well for diverse purposes, and inclusion is definitely one of them. An organization recently asked me, it was a banking organization, and they asked whether they wanted to come up with a policy for neuroinclusion, and they were thinking about starting an employee resource group, but they were wondering, do we need to have one for disabled people separately and then one for neurodivergent people? And I still don't have the answer to that. I know from research and from my own interviews that I did along the years that many neurodivergent people don't necessarily identify with the label of disability. So there might be an issue there. But that aside, there is a sort of shared struggle there of having to face discriminatory attitudes and of having to live and work in processes and practices that are designed with people in mind that are able-bodied or that are neurotypical. And so those processes and practices often work against people who are deemed different. So I don't have the answer of what the best employee research group is like, whether that's a combination of conditions or not. I do believe that it's important for them to be funded by the organization and to allow people who work in those groups to do that during their working hours, so that it doesn't become like a free form of labor that they do on top of their job. I think that's important. Yeah, that's a bit my take on employee resource group, but I'm curious to know what Tristan thinks, because he, of course, is very
Eileen, you won't be surprised to hear that this sounds like music to my ears as an ERG lead. And it's interesting that you mentioned, should neurodiversity have its own ERG, or should it be part of a disability ERG? I hear that question come up a lot as well. So in speaking with peers at other organizations, I agree with you that there's no right or wrong here. I think you can either have neurodiversity as a subgroup under a disability group, or they can be two standalone groups. At Philips, we chose to separate them. So we have a dedicated neurodiversity group, which I lead, which is separate from our disabilities group. Essentially for the reason that you highlighted, Elena, that many neurodivergent people don't necessarily identify as disabled. So we didn't want to force them in that mold. We just want to give everyone the freedom to self-identify however they want to. But of course, as you also said, Alina, there is a lot of overlap in what we're trying to achieve and the barriers that those who are neurodivergent and those, for example, may have physical disabilities, the barriers that they face in their day-to-day work. So we do work closely together with our two ERG to tackle some of these common challenges. Because in reflecting on the role of our ERG, it is, as I said earlier, on the one hand, it's about creating a safe space, but it's also about being an advocate for the community and working in partnership with the organization to work towards neuroinclusion. And one way we do that as an ERG, for example, is also by doing surveys within our community to have data which we can then use in conversations with HR, for example, to show like, hey, these are common pain points and challenges. This is what people are asking for. How can we work together to make that happen? And fully agree with you, Eileen, also that the organization there also needs to step up and take its responsibility. That cannot rest fully on the shoulders of volunteers. And so, for example, at Philips, we now have an official neurodiversity policy in the United Kingdom and Ireland, which I think is a great starting point, because it also signals to people like, hey, this is not just the resource group that is here to support you, but the organization also truly cares and is committed to being neuroinclusive throughout the employee journey from hiring to how people are then onboarded and supported in their growth and development.
Tristan, especially given your success in this area and your experience, would you have any recommendations for someone looking to try and get a employee resource group started at their organization, just based on what you've learned in the journey that you've been on at Philips?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I go back in time, we started 2.5 years ago. I think the power of personal storytelling can really offer you a powerful starting point. I think, Sarah, what you shared about how you shared your personal story, I think never underestimate how much impact that one story can have, because it can be hard, especially in small organizations, to find people who are willing to share their stories within the wider organization. But even if you just find one person who's willing to take that first step, I've seen firsthand how that sets in motion a chain reaction where one person starts sharing, then other people feel like, hey, I feel like it's my responsibility to play my part, and that is how really you can grow a network over time, organically, step by step. So that would be my first tip, like look for people who are willing to share their stories and use that as a starting point. And then secondly, going back to what we discussed about the important role of senior leadership, make sure that you also find at least one sponsor in a leadership position. So at Philips, we have 2 executive sponsors who can really also give you that credibility internally and help open doors for you to start these conversations, because that's much harder to do if you're doing that purely bottom up. You need, I think, that bottom up and top down approach combined.
Those are really, really great suggestions. And I think the next logical question becomes, how do we measure and track progress using KPIs or metrics to really start to see how an organization is doing. Alina, how would you suggest an organization go about tackling the tracking metrics KPI question of neuroinclusion?
Yeah, I think measuring is very important because knowing is power, right? And you can't improve your policies if you don't know where you stand. So I think measuring becomes key. But how do you then do it? That's a very difficult question. I see a lot of organizations struggling with this. And what I typically suggest is to use the measurements that you are already running in your organizations, that you are already doing. For instance, a lot of organizations are doing well-being surveys because they have to, maybe once a year or every 2 years. And you can include in that survey a question, a self-identification question, to see who in your workforce identifies as neurodivergent or also as disabled, for instance. And then you can link the answers that those people give in the survey who identify as such to questions like job satisfaction, general well-being, feeling included, feeling belonging, to sort of see if there is a significant difference there, if they significantly feel less included or less belonging or less satisfied with their job. And so that's a fairly easy, quote unquote, way of measuring how you are doing in terms of including those people. It's important not to do this based solely on an official diagnosis, because of course a lot of people who are a bit of the older generations were not necessarily diagnosed. I got diagnosed because I was really driven to be diagnosed and to find out if I officially belong to this community to which I knew I belong, of course. But many people at a later age, why would they? There's no need, and there was not this habit of diagnosing them when they were children at school, unlike is being done with children now. So it's important to base this, to also accept that people might have a suspicion of being neurodivergent and not just basing this on an official diagnosis. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
That's very, very good recommendations. Tristan, would you add anything based on your experience to
Yeah, I mean, I already alluded to the value of doing surveys, so I fully agree with Aileen that is a very helpful way to start gathering data. I will add as a nuance that trust plays a critical role there, because at least from my experience, neurodivergent individuals, for the reasons we discussed in this session, may not feel comfortable sharing their neurodivergence. So even when they can do that anonymously in a survey that is sent out by HR, for example, they may still feel that barrier, like, is this really anonymous? So what I've experienced by also running a survey in our employee resource group, which is run by us as a team and which HR doesn't directly have access to, that can also be an additional way of gathering data, because and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it can be easier for neurodivergent people to trust an employee resource group that represents them versus official organization channels. So that is just something to consider for those organizations who have or are considering to set up a neurodiversity ERG, that you can also use that ERG as a channel to gather data in a way that people maybe will trust more easily.
That's a really great recommendation. I think it really comes down to trust, and especially as an organization is starting this journey, I think there's a lot that they need to do to build trust within the community. before people may feel comfortable answering those. And that's a nice idea as a way to just create a little extra space there. We do have some time for Q&A. So on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a Q&A box. So go ahead and type in any questions that you might have based on the discussion that we've had today. And then we will go through and take a few of those questions and turn them to our panelists. Let's start with the first one here. See if I can display it on the screen. From your various perspectives, is there a single misconception about neurodiversity in the workplace that you think endures in spite of your best efforts?
If I may, I think there's a lot of misconceptions, but maybe one that is particularly popular now is the idea that neurodiversity will in and of itself lead to benefits and superpowers and more profits. But it could easily go the other way. Increasing the number of neurodivergent employees could also backfire, because as with many forms of diversity, it needs to somehow be managed to make sure that people can thrive and use their talents and be seen. So it's not so easy that neurodiversity always translates into, benefits or superpowers, and not even in specific context, because there's many people who think, autistic people, they will be very good in IT-ish jobs. And even there, that's not necessarily so simple. So I think that's a big misconception. And although as a community, we like stressing the talents we have because that brings a positive identity. And that's very necessary politically because we've been denied of that identity for so long. Still, it's a bit more complicated, and HR and supervisors, colleagues, they need to put in a bit of work, as do neurodivergent people themselves, of course, to make those benefits really happen and to foster, the benefits of neurodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may add, I think another common misperception that this conversation is just about those who are neurodivergent. And I think Elina, Sarah, you already alluded to the fact that this is ultimately about understanding that we are all different. And the better managers, leaders are able to navigate that in their day-to-day work, the more effective we're all going to be, not just those who are neurodivergent. So I think that's also a really important point to keep in mind, and that can also help you draw wider interest from within the organization in this topic versus when you position it as if this is just about supporting group X or Y.
I think that's a very good point. Next question. Do you have any suggestions about external communication? How can a company that works on neuroinclusion make it evident also to potential applicants?
Yeah, maybe I can share two examples from my experiences looking at what we've already done at Philips. I think, first of all, going back to what we discussed about role models, it can be incredibly valuable if in your employer branding, you also share these personal stories from neurodivergent colleagues or leaders. We regularly do that. And I've seen, again, firsthand how that also really attracts talent. Like I've literally had people reach out to me on LinkedIn saying like, hey, I saw some of these stories on the Philips website. I'd love to learn more about what it's like to work for Philips as a neurodivergent person. So I think it can help you attract talent, but then you also need to make sure that the hiring process is inclusive. And that is, I think, something that you, for example, can already start doing also in your job descriptions, by offering clarity on the process, by highlighting only qualities that are really critical to that role, rather than maybe typical behaviors that may not come as naturally to neurodivergent people. So I think there are a lot of things that you can do as an employer also to spotlight this topic as a way of attracting talent,
Mhm.
but then also ensuring that you support that talent once they apply for a job at your company.
Yeah, and maybe you could also spotlight collaborations that you have as an organization with organizations that are led by neurodivergent people or disability-led organizations. Or you could donate money as an organization to organizations that help. There's this great organization called Made by Dyslexia, which organizations can fund. And by sponsoring such organizations, you of course also indicate to potential dyslexic candidates that their organization will be a very warm environment for them.
Or you could partner with universities and other educational institutions to also ease the path for neurodivergent talent from the education system into the workforce, because that in itself can be a very rocky path for many neurodivergent people.
Yeah, great suggestion. Okay, we have time for one more question. And I love this one because I think this is my question too. As a neurodivergent person in IT, our weekly meetings focus on gossip, personal chat, which drain my energy for the whole day. Manager sees it as team bonding. How can I explain that for me it isn't bonding, but exhausting without seeming difficult?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I think openness is key here. If your manager, after explaining why this is exhausting to you, ends up still wanting to see you as difficult, that's a problem that is on them, I think. I think gossiping is never really good for the environment, not even for bonding. But okay, people can have different opinions, I guess. But I feel the pain. I mean, it can be very draining, these kinds of social interactions, on top of all the other social scripts that you have to engage in. Tristan, do you have a better answer?
Yeah, first of all, to the person who shared this question, I feel you. I've been there many times myself in my career, and I know it can be very challenging to bring this up, also depending on how open your manager is to having this type of conversation. I think I've been relatively lucky. My philosophy that I've tried to also get across in working with managers is make sure as a manager that you separate the optional social chit chat from the task-oriented, goal-oriented work. Ideally, you do that in different settings and not in the same meeting. I also recall it, from my perspective, a really draining meeting where 50% of the time was just spent discussing people's holidays. For me, that felt very draining. While I fully understand, while for other people in the team, that was a lovely way to connect. So I then also suggested to my manager, like, hey, for those who enjoy that, offer some sort of platform to have these conversations, but maybe in a team meeting where I enter that meeting with the expectation of discussing actual work, ensure that you have a clear agenda, just focus on the actual work for the team meeting, separating it so that people can join when they can join optionally the social gathering, and everyone is in the team meeting to discuss the actual work. I'm not sure if that will land with your manager, but that is the conversation that I had once.
Great suggestion. I love it. Elena, Tristan, thank you so much for your time today. Just a few housekeeping things. One, we wanted to just mention that this is part of a bigger focus here on neuroinclusion at top employers. We have two resources for you. We have a very great research report that we have just finished on neuroinclusion, and you can go ahead and click on the link in the chat to be able to download that report. We also have a new product that is focused on helping organizations build neuroinclusive workplaces. This is something that we are really passionate about at top employers, and we have taken that passion in and built a product to help organizations on their journey to becoming neuroinclusive. So if you would like to learn more, you can just click on the link to discover that option. Thank you all for taking the time for this insightful session. Our speakers were absolutely fantastic. I know I learned a lot, and I hope that you did as well. You'll receive an email with a session recording and a short survey. Your feedback is so important to us, and it helps us improve for future events. The survey link is also visible on your screen now, so if you want to take 2 minutes, you can just go ahead and fill that out. Thanks again for everyone and for joining me, Tristan, Elena, and it has been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.